Hi everyone, welcome to Angular tutorials. In this section, I'm going to discuss about a concept called binding in Angular. Binding in Angular will provide a way to attach model and view in your web applications. So generally, there are some situations. Let me go for this. Okay, so there are situations in our applications that we need to transfer the data to the view part, nothing but HTML content or the web page, what we have. Okay, and this is the database, the string database, and this is a view part. So if any changes happens inside the database, I want to transfer it to the view part. Similarly, if there is any changes inside the view part, for example, the user entering some username, password, or email address, something like that, they are going to enter. That means those changes need to be stored inside this model. So this is what we can call binding, data binding, I can refer. So it will provide a way to transfer the data between the model and the view. So that is what actually the binding is. We are going to allow the changes that is going to be happen inside the model to the view part, and we are going to allow the changes happening inside this view part to be notified by the model as well. Okay, that is what is called binding. Let us see the scenario. Actually, the binding is classified into different categories. One is data binding, class binding, style binding, and attribute binding. So the example what we have seen is just for data binding. Okay, so in this data binding, we have some other subsections of the property binding, event binding, and two-way binding. Okay, let us understand the data binding. That means we are going to bind the data between model and view, or view to model, and vice versa. So in this data binding, okay, we are going to providing property binding, which is going to allow the changes happens inside the model to be notified to the view section. That is called property binding. And event binding is going to allow the changes happening inside this view to be notified by the or notified to the model. Okay, that is event binding. So if a user enters characters in a text field that need to be stored inside a database or inside a variable, that is called view to model attachment or model to view attachment. And we can do the both by using property binding and event binding. We can perform model to view and view to model as well. So let's see and let us understand one by one what actually the property binding and event binding and how to achieve the two-way binding by using these two. Okay, the first one, property binding. You know, every HTML element will have its own properties. Like in this case, you can take an input element, okay, which is having some attributes like type, value. Okay, so if you want to make this content to be dynamic, okay, here we have an attribute called type, and you are passing something called text text. Okay, so this text you are entering as a static content. If you want to make this text as a dynamic, that means either you can pass text, or you can pass a radio button, or you can pass checkbox. So there are some situations, instead of placing a text here, you can pass a variable If you change the value inside that variable, based on that, the type of the input variable is going to change. Okay, so that is what I did with the help of a value attribute. And the property binding syntax is going to be used with something called square braces. And I'm passing a variable name called name. So this is the syntax of the property binding. You need to use a square braces for the attribute what we are going to bind with a dynamic variable. Let's come back to our code. Let us create a simple, what we can call inside this app folder we have. In the last session, we created a my custom component, right? Now what I'm going to do, I just want to create a new component called ng space c space binding component. So for every section, I want to maintain a separate component. That's why I'm going to create a binding component here. Now, it's going to create a binding component, okay, and it's already registered, okay. So that is the advantage of making use of Angular CLI. So let's go to the TypeScript file, okay. Inside this TypeScript file, you have a lot of by default content is there, okay. Here, look at the class. I don't want this particular content right away. For the time being, I don't want this content as well. Let's make the thing simple. This is a simple TypeScript class. So now this is a component, okay, a simple component. This TypeScript class is a simple component. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a variable name called name, okay, something I want to pass. I want to initialize this with a string called so John. You can take John. Okay, I just created a variable name. Let's have a look to the binding.component.html. Inside this, I'm going to create an input element, which is having a type attribute. At the same time, I'm going to take a value equal to something like hello. Let us make this to hello, and I want to make this to a closing syntax. Let me start this application. I think it's already started. Let's go to the no changes reflected here. Why? Because you haven't attached this binding component to the root component. So what I'm going to do, go to your root component, and first of all, you have to know the selector name, something you have. Okay, in this, I'm going to pass a binding, something like this. For the time being, I just want to comment on the previous components what we created. This is for binding components, right? So let's have a look in the browser. See, this text field was initialized with something called hello. That is possible when you pass a value to the value attribute. So if you want to make this text to be more dynamic, okay, you need to place a variable instead of that particular a simple static text. But if you want to bind this variable to this value attribute, you need to use a syntax, something called property binding syntax. Now, here you have created a name called John. So this property binding syntax will automatically replace this name with a John. Let's have a look. Already it's running in the background. So John is coming. Got it? So this is what is called property binding. So with the help of the property binding, you are going to initialize the state of that particular input element. Okay? So that is a simple property binding. I can refer property binding. So you can understand that you are passing some data here, and that is going to be appear on the input element, the view. That means with the help of property binding, you can achieve something called model to view part. This kind of binding is happening with the help of property binding. And let me change this to John to something called Satish. Okay, save this. You got a Satish value here. That means you are initializing the component or the element with, or what you call the state of that particular element with your dynamic variable. Got it? Now let's have a look for event binding. So event binding will allow you to bind view to model. Okay, something like this. You can create an event and you can pass some event values instead of what we call the changes can be notified by using a event binding. Okay, let's see, have a look on this. For the same input element, I'm going to take, so let's make this to be event binding, which will provide view to model, right? So instead of this, you can take it out for the time being. I'm going to what do you call pass an event, something called key press or key up. So, but that event need to be surrounded by the round braces. Okay, and you can pass a dynamic function, something like this. So you need to create that function here. And first of all, let me categorize this. Here we have a fields, nothing but data or model, you can refer. And you have something called functions, nothing but logic or controller. Okay, here I'm going to write something called on change or on key press, something like that you can use. What I have given on change, let's go for on key press. Any name of the function you can use. Okay, no need to provide on key press. You can provide any name. So you can pass on key press. This is the function I created. Okay, fine. Inside this, I want to display a simple text, something like event triggered. Just I want to let you to know that when I entered a character, this particular log message will be printed. Okay, so let's make use of this. What I did, I simply make use of an event called key press for the input element. Okay, so I surrounded this key press event with round braces in Angular. That is called event binding, and that is going to be attached to a simple function called on key press. Okay, now let's go here. This is second element what we have, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use something called a BR element. Okay, let's have a label. I'm going to pass property binding. Just I want to differentiate this one. That's it. Okay, and this is to be label event binding. Okay, I think this will be something what we have. You can pass a simple gap. Now press F12. Now inside this, if you entered anything, a console message need to be triggered. See, I entered 4 characters. I got 4 times even triggered, right? So, see, the count has been increasing when I entered something like this. Okay, so based on the number of characters I'm entering, so the event, that means this is going to call this function, right? On key press every time when I press a key. This is called event binding. So what we achieve, so whatever the data I'm entering here, that is going to be notified, that is going to be notified by this function. Now I can do one thing. So I'm going to take one more variable. Okay, update. So something I'm going to take update variable. Okay. Now that variable I'm going to take this dot update equal to, yeah, for the time being, I want to update this variable, right? So what you have to do is you need to pass the data. Okay. So whatever the data that you are entering, that is need to be notified here. So dollar event I'm going to pass. So dollar event is an event object, just like a jQuery event object syntax. Angular also providing dollar event. Through this, I'm able to identify which character got typed on this particular text field. Okay, so that is I'm going to pass. So here also I'm going to take event here, dollar event, that is makes this to be similar, and dollar event dot. So actually, if you want to know what actually the dollar event contains, you can print it out, something called, or you can take this out, you can pass dollar event. Now let's have a look in the browser. When I entered a character, now I can see event trigger. It's showing a keyboard event, which is having a lot of what we can call a lot of properties are encapsulated as a single object, and that is passed as a dollar event to this particular function. So in this particular object, there is something called value in the target. Go to this object, target dot value will refer what character that you typed on this particular input element. So I'm going to make use of it. Dollar event target dot value. So every value when I enter, that will be stored inside this particular update variable. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass that inside the console, so I can see the changes, what is happening in that particular input element, that will be notified through this on key press. So that means I'm able to get what are the changes that is happening inside that input element. I'm able to notify inside the console window, right? With the help of this event binding by calling this function. Now let's have a look. So SATISH. Now you can see what are the changes. You can find that one. Of course, you are not getting the H variable, I mean H character here. So that is what actually the key press will do. you can change the event to something like on key up. Now you are able to see every character in the console window what you typed. Yes. TISH. See? So that means with the help of property binding, you are initializing the state of the element of the HTML element. And with the help of event binding, you are able to get the internal changes outside of the particular element, right? So this is what is called event binding. And there are some situations that there are some situations that sometimes you don't need to pass dollar event. Okay, so you can have a class variable instead of passing that. Okay, you can take a class variable, something like that. Event data you can refer, right? You can get this one. So event data. Now you can take it out in semicolon. Event data is equal to dollar event. See, inside this event binding, you can pass the different statements. You're calling a one function and you're executing another variable, right? You need to call this function after executing this particular event data. Something like this. So you are passing directly the event.target.value to this event data variable, which is a class variable. You can make use of it. And instead of passing this entire dollar event, you can use event data. So this is much cleaner way of writing the code. And so the previous way, what I'm doing, like I'm passing some dollar event, right? That is a regular procedure-oriented programming. But if you want to make use of object-oriented programming features, non what we call always you can make use of the class variable that will be attached to the view content like this. This is an effective way. Now it's running. Now let me change. Let me have some changes here. So that is reflected back. Something like this. Right? So that is what actually event binding is. The next one is you can achieve two-way binding. So two-way binding, that means you can attach or you can initialize the variable property value, nothing but model to view, and you can perform view to model as well using both property binding and event binding. Now come back to your code. Let's comment out the previous one. Okay. So I'm going to take one more variable. See, this is the lengthy code what we have. Again, I'm going to write something lengthy code. Two-way binding. Inside this, take it off. Two-way binding. I just have taken one more input variable. So two-way binding means you can attach something like I can do something like, with the help of property binding, I can initialize the state of the input variable, input element, and with the help of event binding, I make other elements or I make the internal changes to be viewed to other elements. Okay, by calling this function. Now, what we do is I'm just passing this particular code. Fine. let us take this particular, instead of on key press, on change. Let's have some changes here. On changes. Okay, this is, I don't want this event data. So fine, I'm going to take event data itself. Okay, let's have this one. Now let's take on change data, something like this. I'm going to create one more variable, on change data, on change data. Another variable I'm going to create. So here, on change, so I have created a function. You need to write a function, something like event handler. So what I want to do, I want to pass some information. So what is called I'll take something like, on change data, on change update. I'm going to take updated data. Let's take a variable like this. So that will be differentiate. So here, what I'm going to do, this dot on change updated data equal to this dot on change data. I'm just updating this one. Okay. So I'm going to make use of this variable data. Of course, you can use directly this one as well, but just for make the things in a better way. So here I'm going to take one more span element. Inside that, I'm going to use interpolation or something like property binding you can call. I'm passing that one. This is the way you can achieve the two-way binding. One is going to allow you to know that means whatever the changes that is going to be happen in the view that will be updated to the model. Here the model is on change data. And the same model, I can make use of it something like updated data. So for example, updated data, right? Updated data. This is another variable. I'm just passing to another variable in order to differentiate it. Okay. Now, here from the input element, we are doing something like view to model, and in the span model. This is a model now. Model to view. Okay. So here, what are the changes that is happening inside this on change data that will appear on this particular on change update data as well. So the changes coming from the view to model, and again the same changes will be reflected back to the span. That means model to view. This is called two-way binding. Now let's come back to your browser, and I want to differentiate it. Let's have two BR statements so that you can differentiate the things. Two-way binding, right? So whenever I enter something like hello world. So whatever the changes I made, those changes reflected back to the view itself. So this is what is called two-way binding. You are passing the data from view to model. You are storing something like on change data. The same change data is going to be reflected back to the span element. Okay, this is called two-way binding. Okay. Of course, you can achieve the two-way binding in another way in Angular with the help of ng model directive. Two-way binding using ng model. ng model directive. So this ng model directory itself provides a two-way binding. Okay, something that we have two-way binding using ng model directory. Just having this one. If you want, you can have. Now here, I'm going to take an input element again, the same type. I'm just using something called ng model, a directive which is available inside your Angular. And you need to provide something like round braces, which is event binding. On top of it, you're going to pass property binding. So that is two-way binding you're going to do. Okay, and you can pass something like, you can pass a function or a variable. Okay, in this case, I'm going to pass a variable, something like uname. Okay, username, something like uname. I'm going to take. Okay, now you can see that I'm going to take uname. So what are the data that is going to be entered by the user in this input field that will be stored inside this variable called uname. And if you want to reflect the same changes, okay, you can use span element and you can pass the same uname over here, okay, so that you can reflect the same things here. But unfortunately, you will get an error that ng model, since it's not a known property of input, it's telling that it doesn't know about ng model. Why? Because ng model will not appear in core libraries of Angular. It will appear inside what we can call forms module. So you need to import the forms module in the app.module. So there, inside this import sections of this ng model, okay, you have to import something called form module. Of course, you need to provide something called form. Let's see. What's not forms module only. Forms module. I think I need to import this directly. Import forms module from @angular/forms. Okay, let's check this out. Okay, I think it's a forms only, a form module only. That's a typo here. And just save it. See, no error. I'm able to get this one. So whenever you use ng model directive, it will create a problem like this. That means it will be available inside forms module, not inside core module. So you need to import that form module, right? So what are the changes I made that is reflected back? So with the help of ng model, you can write a less code in order to bind the data. Now you can see these two syntaxes on the two-way binding, which is more effective. This one is more effective. You have written a simple code, right, for this input element. Here, you did a lot of code. You write a lot of code in order to bind the data. But you did this one. Okay, and someone may get, why can't they use instead of updated data? Can I use like this? Yeah, you can use this one. Okay, nothing fantasy over here. The same changes is going to be reflected back. Okay, now you can see something we're getting error. Undefined, unexpected value undefined in the app module. What was that? There are some, okay, something like this. You need to use forms module. Okay. So what are the changes I made? That is reflected back. Here also the same thing. But the code what I have written is lengthy in the first case than the next one, that's using the NG model, right? So this is what is called two-way binding using NG model. So let's have. So I'm just closing this particular thing so that you are able to see some more code. So let's have some BR tags. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to introduce a new concept called input and output. Okay. Generally, with the help of property binding, you are inputting something to the HTML element for the input what you have created. Okay. Through value attribute, you're passing some value inside of it, right? Something like this. That means you are initializing the state of this input element by passing something into it. That is, so property binding will allow you to input some data into this HTML element. And with the help of event binding, we are able to know the internal changes of this particular input element. Okay, that means it's outputting some data using event binding. So whatever the character I am typing over here, so those changes is reflected back, right? That is called event binding. Okay, those changes I'm able to observe. I'm able to observe through this event binding. So that means outputting the data. Okay, so if you have inputting and outputting data, then this input element is more reusable, and you can connect this element to other elements instead of HTML template, right? So this concept will be again explained in custom components input and output decorators. Okay, so that will be in the next session. Now, what I want to do before going for class binding and style binding, I want to introduce how to make use of the Bootstrap framework classes in our Angular application. First, what you have to do is you need to install the Bootstrap with npm package. Okay, something I can go with this. Let me install it. npm install bootstrap save dev. So this particular flags will make your package.json. I told you already, package.json is going to maintain a list of tools or versions of the tools and libraries that is going to be used in our Angular application. Okay, so when I use something like in this Angular application, I mean package.json, you have two sections, something called dependencies and development dependencies. Dependencies, I mean, development dependencies means if you want to develop the Angular application, definitely these kind of tools are necessary. These kind of libraries are necessary. Okay, dependencies are the tools or libraries which are very much needed when you want to run your Angular application. So I'm going to save this in a development dependency. Okay, so that will be stored inside of it. That's why I entered this particular thing. Let's enter. So it will take a while. So the Bootstrap got installed, and that is listed inside this particular. I think it was there inside the dependencies. I think the hyphen there is not work, so it's installed inside the uh, dependencies, and the version is 4.1.3. Now, let us make use of this particular Bootstrap in your application. What I'm going to do inside this binding, I'm just going to take something, a button. Okay, I'm going to add some buttons here. Class equal to btn primary. Okay, something like a button, something simply I can just give a button here. So then remove some classes. Now you can see, I hope you will get a button, Bootstrap button. Of course, it's not available here. Why? Because you need to import that Bootstrap button, okay, inside your CSS file. Where is the CSS file? This is the CSS file. What you do, @import. This is a simple CSS import statement. So the Bootstrap will be available inside Node modules. Once it's installed, go to the Node modules and look after the Bootstrap. It was Bootstrap. Inside that dist folder, distribution folder, and you have the CSS something like this, right? So what do? You can make it on the tail, the location Bootstrap. Inside that, you have a dist folder /css/bootstrap dot min.css, or CSS, you can directly make use of it. So when you use this one, okay, it will make your application is going to up and running with Bootstrap. See, by default, the button has been changed to Bootstrap button, right? So let's go for the binding component. Now, what I want to do, I want to tell you about something called class binding. Okay, so let's have a look on this PPT. So class binding is used to bind the class names based on the condition. Okay, so this will make use of the property binding syntax only, the square braces. Okay, so let's have a look. I'm going to take one more element, button. Okay, something called class binding. I'm just wanna notify or understand the things like this. So inside this, class is equal to btn primary, and I want to add one more class. Okay, that class need to be what we call initialized based on the condition, or it need to be added based on the condition. So I'm going to take class dot btn uccs success. Okay, that this btn hyphen success is a Bootstrap class. I want this class to be added dynamically by using a status variable. So let's create a status variable. Initially, I'm going to make this as a false. Okay. So class binding. So initially, I'm not able to get any green color syntax for this button, on green color for the button itself. Okay, let me add just for the changes purpose. So I'm going to close this one. Now let us wrap the content. Word wrap. So I'm going to wrap this itself so that you can understand what is happening. Okay. So this is my Bootstrap class. I'm adding through success. Through this status variable. So initially this is false. This is not going to be appear. So if you want to know that, just go to the elements. Click on the class binding. You can see class equal to BTN, BTN primary, right? Now what I'm going to do, let me make this variable value as true. Okay, that means the class need to be attached to the button variable. Now you can see a green color and look at the code, BTN success is also appearing. Okay, let's have fun for this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to add one more code that is called on click on this button. Okay, something like change color, change BTN color. I can take BTN color, button color. So I'm going to pass here. What is the name of the function? In order to avoid the errors, you can take this function code, function name, and copy here. Okay, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a status variable. By default, it's a true value, right? I'm going to complement it, okay? And I'm going to reassign it to the same variable. Now, what happens is, when I click the button, it will call this function, which is going to toggle the state of the color of the button. Now let's see what happens when I click on this. See, it changes to blue color. The class has been removed. I click on this, a new class has been added. See? So based on the click, I'm able to change the button color. Got it? So this is what is called class binding. Okay. So with the help of property syntax, we can bind classes dynamically. Okay. The next one is style binding. It is similar to the class binding, but you can bind the style, a single property, with the based on the condition. So you can take one more element. Okay, I'm going for BR, BR, BR. So I'm going to place this as class binding and style binding. Okay, button. Style binding. So inside this, this is the button name, what I'm going to provide. So I'm going to take a bootstrap classes for initially BTN, BTN primary. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, I want to pass a style. Something, what style I can go for? Style binding, style dot border. Okay, style dot border equal to and enable border. I'm going to take enable border, something like that. En border. This is a variable I'm going to create, and inside this you can pass a border value. You know, it should be 2 pixels solid. Unfortunately, I'm getting something wrong. It's double quoted. This is double quoted. Solid. I'm going to take a border of black color. Otherwise, I'll just pause the question. Again, it should be what we can call 2 pixels dotted border as 0, 0, 0. So let's see whether it's will work or not. Fine. So by default, you have the dotted border. When I click on this, you need to get a, what do we call, the regular border, right? So you need to create a variable called enable border. I'm going to create one more variable, enable border, that equal to a falsy value. So when I click on the button, I need to make some changes. So change btn border, right? So this dot in border equal to complement of enable border. This dot enable border. Fine. So I just created this. I just complementing the en border variable. Now come back here. Okay. When I click on this, of course I haven't created any function, click function. Okay. Now for this, I'm going to add something called on click. I need to call a function on, what was that? It's a function you need to call, and come back here. Let's close this one. See, I need to get thick border, and I think something gone wrong. Something is applied. The border need to be enable border need to be initial border having. It's having a value of false, right? Change border. So let's make this condition 2. This final shall create. So let us make this to be, where is the binding? I just want to make this value to be true. Okay. And let's see whether we are getting a solid border around it. No. So unfortunately, my code has been creating a problem. I think there is a typo mistake here. Instead of border, this is border, right? Border. BORDER. Fine. Let's have a look. See, by default, we have this. See, the border is dotted now. When I click on this, it's a solid version. Like this, you can find. So like this, you are able to apply the style to your elements using the style binding of Angular. Okay. So the last but not least, I'll go with attribute binding. Okay. So in this, First of all, what we need to understand is, if you do have an input element, for example, I'm going for something like, if I have an input element, let us talk about this input element, or let us create a separate file, a JavaScript file or HTML file. Just have a look. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just want to open this HTML file directly. Let us try. So let's have this file. Okay, fine. Now what I'm going to do this particular thing is, I'm going to take an input element, okay, which is having a value attribute, value equal to hello. Okay, and this input having a name called username. Now press F12. Let's refresh this one. You have something. You concentrate on this particular input field. Whatever the remaining things we have, forget about those things. You're not working with respect to Angular. I want to directly point out this one. So what I'm going to do, this is what we can call an input element. Now I'm going to use something called, I'm going to create an object where obj is equal to document dot query selector of input element. So the input element I want to pick up is, name should be username. Name should be username. So that means this is the input element I'm trying to select. So I click on this, try to open it, and you're getting this particular input field, right? So if you want to get the attribute value, okay, either you can use obj dot value, you will get hello. That is what we have. There are other way you can access the same content, something like what is called get attribute method. Okay, what attribute you want to access? The value attribute. Fine. So what I want to explain in this case is, when you are talking about the attribute binding, okay, every input element or every element in HTML having some attributes, okay, the same HTML element will be created as a object inside your browser, the DOM, document object model. So what are the attributes that are there inside the HTML code that will be reflected as a property of that object? So that means there should be there will be a one-to-one mapping between attribute and property. But there are some situations, okay, we don't have any one-to-one mapping for attributes what we're going to provide as a property. Okay, so I'm trying to get the values. So let us go back to your Angular. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just creating a table now. Okay, I'm going for the table t head. Okay, inside this we have a t body. Let us make this to be, okay, I don't want this t head, all this stuff for the time being. I can use a tr block, td, this is one, and inside this td we have 2014, okay, td something like 710 crores, okay, 710 crores. Similarly, I'm going to make use of another one, another one like this. And this is to be serial number 2 in 2015. The profit is around 725 crores. 3 and profit is 750 crores. I just created a variable, a table, okay, which is having a border into 1 pixel. Let's have. Then let's bring this down. You can see, not here, you can see a table at the bottom, right? You can see a table at the bottom. So if you want to join two columns, what you do, you can have something called call span. Sorry, call span equal to 2, and you can take out this one. Now you can see two columns are going to merge. You can see these two columns got merged and it's showing only one content. Okay, so can I use a property binding for this call span like this? Will it work? Definitely not. Why? Because this call span is an attribute, and this is call span doesn't have a what we call a property in the DOM. Okay, a one-to-one mapping, what I have shown in the PPT slide. So in this input element, value is a proper attribute. So this input element will be created as an object in DOM, and value is a property now. So attribute have one-to-one mapping with the property that is to the object what is created, right? But that is not the case when we look into a call span. So that means why? Because call span doesn't have one-to-one mapping. That means we don't have the call span property when the table object got created inside your DOM. So that's the problem. So first of all, let us understand what actually the property and what actually the attribute. Okay. So you can have some code here. So if you want to get the property, you can use object dot value. That it will get a property. If you want to get the attribute value, obj dot get attribute. So you can see if I'm going to change this to, instead of hello, I'm going to change this to Satish. Okay, Satish, I just entered. Now here obj dot value is Satish, and obj dot get attribute, okay, of value is hello only. That means attribute is different from the property, which is a property of an object created inside the DOM, the corresponding object created in the DOM. So both are referring to the input element only, but the attribute is different and property is different. Property will be works when object got created. The attribute will works only inside the HTML code only. So whatever the value that is there inside the HTML code, here we have hello is there inside the HTML code. That is, it's going to show. Now you can see that inside the HTML code, what we have given hello. So when I say get attribute, it is getting the hello only. But the property is going to show the internal changes, right? The property. So that's why your what we call the call span doesn't have a one-to-one mapping like this. So the call span attribute doesn't have a property, okay, inside the table object. Why? Because the call span itself, you're telling the HTML itself that you need to merge two columns. That you are going to, that is not a bit dynamic, right? It is statically you are mentioning that one. So that's why the HTML, what it will do, it won't create a property of call span in the table object when it's created inside the DOM. Now, how do I make this attribute as a dynamic in nature? So I want to provide a call span value to something, what do we call a number of a dynamic way. Go here, come back here, number of columns. I'm going to take like this columns equal to 2. Let's take number. So how do I attach this variable to this call span? Why? Because call span doesn't have a property. Doesn't going to be a property in the DOM. So for this purpose, Angular provide a separate kind of syntax, something called attribute binding. In order to set the attribute, you can use attr.callSpan. So now it will work. Error gone. Now the two columns got merged together. So this is what is called attribute binding. Okay, fine. That's about the binding. We learned something about what is the binding. Okay, how many types of bindings are there? There are 4 types of bindings: data binding, class binding, style binding, and attribute binding. Inside the data binding, again, you have property binding, event binding, and two-way binding. We have come across, or we understand that with the help of property binding, we can bind that what we call a model to view, and with the help of event binding, we can bind view to model. Okay, and with the help of property binding, we are going to initialize the state of the element. With the help of event binding, we are able to know the internal changes of the state of the element, right? So these are the things what we have seen. Of course, we come across something called a directive called ng model, which is used for two-way binding. That is predefined attribute or directive which is provided by the Angular. Okay, fine. So that's about the binding. Then thank you. We'll see you in the next session. Okay.